Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, the fifth video in this chapter 5, Asymmetrical Synthesis of the Sensible. And what can I say about this? This video is just going to cover one topic, individuation. I had planned on doing more, but to be honest, it just took so long to prepare this section. It's not huge, it's not long, and I don't think the video is going to be long, although I have been caught out by making that claim in the past. But I'm pretty sure this is not going to be one of the longer videos I make. It just took so long to prepare that there were so many kind of details that I really had to spend some time clarifying for myself before I can present them to you. So yeah, it took a long time to prepare. I wanted to do some more of this chapter in this video, but didn't get there. So individuation is where we are for today. So let's just it's a single topic. Let's have a look at it. Individuation. So if you remember at the end of the last video, I talked about intensity, and the question we asked was, how does intensity determine the movement of actualization? And the answer was individuation. So individuation is basically, it's the step in between differentiation and differenciation with a C. It's the way that intensity determines the actualization. And Deleuze says intensity is individuating, and intensive quantities are individuating factors. So intensity is when it's entering that process of implication and enveloping, moving towards the ultimate explication in an actualized entity. It does that through individuation, through this process by which an individual is generated, if I can use that word. So we'll look at some of the details, but before we do, Deleuze talks about Gilbert Simondon. He references Gilbert Simondon, and the reference is surely to his book Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. Such an unwieldy and unappealing title, but the book is really, really good. It's really worth reading. It's not an easy read, of course, but definitely interesting. And there are a lot of parallels actually between Simondon and Deleuze. So anyway, Simondon, as Deleuze mentions in Difference and Repetition, talks about individuation presupposing a prior, therefore pre-individual, metastable state, which is made up of disparateness between two heterogeneous realities. And that just sounds like something straight out of Difference and Repetition almost, right? So this pre-individual state, Simondon says, contains singularities, another word we're familiar with, which are kind of like points around which things can happen, points around which something can coalesce, if you like, and trigger a reaction, catalyze a reaction or a development or a process. And really similar but a little bit different to the way that Deleuze uses the word. He also, Simondon this is, also talks about this metastable state as being problematic, a problematic field, and individuation is the solving of this problem. And that runs all the way through Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. Man, you don't want to say that too many times, right? And the individual then is attached to a pre-individual half, which is not impersonal so much as a reservoir of singularities. And so that's Simondon, and that's what Deleuze has to say about him in this section. Now, if we just compare this idea, this set of ideas to Deleuze on individuation, the quote is, "Individuation is essentially intensive, and the pre-individual field is a virtual ideal field made up of differential relations. Individuation is the act by which intensity determines differential relations to become actualized, along the lines of differenciation and within the qualities and extensities it creates." So that's Deleuze. And first of all, let's just pick out some of the overlapping points. By the way, Simondon wrote that book, or published it, in 1964, which is 4 years before Deleuze published Difference and Repetition. So I think these ideas, difference, Derrida was talking about this at the same time, difference, this idea of metastable realities and singularities, I think these kinds of thoughts were in the air at the time, I think. But anyway, so the similarities, we've got in both this pre-individual field is understood as in Simondon metastable, and in Deleuze it's the virtual ideal field of the idea. Simondon talks about disparateness. Deleuze obviously has differential relations. They both talk about singularities, not in exactly the same way, but in very similar ways. And they both make use of this metaphor of problems and solutions, understanding how things come about, how things are actualized, how individuals are formed through this idea of the organism or the object being, the entity maybe being a solution to a problem. So a problem being generated and then actual concrete entities being solutions to that problem. So that's I like that way of thinking. I think it gets us down to this deeper level, this what I would call the metaphysical level, where we're not thinking, we're not constrained so much by kind of higher order emergent features that tend to make up our empirical lives, and that then color our thinking so that we can't really get a grasp of the origin of these things. So that's how the two kind of overlap. Just drilling in on some of the main points in that quote, though, individuation is intensive. So this is important. Intensity, all of that, we've been spending the last few videos have all been centered around intensity. Intensity here sets up a field which determines subsequent actualization. So individuation is fundamentally intensive. It's the direct result of the difference of intensity that we have isolated in the idea. So it might make sense, or it might help to think of this in terms of what we talked about at the end of last video, where we distinguished between ideas and intensities. So the idea is this, that's where we've got the differential relations. That's where there's no individual there. This is, we're talking here pre-individual singularities distributed within the idea. And these, so what we've got, this is a virtual multiplicity, which determines problems, which is concerned with the generation of problems and questions, or irony, Deleuze would call that. And then the other side, then intensity, that's what we're focusing on here with individuation, because it's with intensities as those implicated multiplicities that the individual emerges, a field of individuation is set up, and the individual emerges here as solutions, the solutions which will determine the actualization. And this, Deleuze, we've seen, connects with humour. So we're focusing on the second half of that. Still not full actualization. This is still intermediate to that, but it's how intensity is able to move from the idea, if you like, into the actualized reality. So I've got another quote, which I'm going to read, and then we'll break down. Most of this video, actually, I'm just going to give you a quote, and then we'll discuss it. It's kind of the way I've approached this topic. So anyway, individuation precedes differentiation in principle. Every differentiation presupposes a prior intense field of individuation. It is because of the action of the field of individuation that such and such differential relations and such distinctive points, pre-individual fields, are actualized. In other words, organized within intuition along lines differentiated in relation to other lines. As a result, they then form the quality, number, species, and parts of an individual, in short, its generality. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to pull out there is this the difference between actualize and differentiate, which I don't think I've emphasized before. So to actualize, so he says to actualize is to organize along lines differentiated in relation to other lines. So to actualize then means to go from the virtual to the actual. And we also talked about to incarnate there. Deleuze doesn't seem to make too much of a distinction between those two words, actualization and incarnation, here, but that's what we're talking about, that movement from the virtual to the actual. And differentiate, then, with a C, is the way that the actualized reality is distinct from other potential lines of actualization. So in a way, then, it's kind of like on the ideal side, you've got differentiation with a T, and that's how the elements within the idea are different. It's how they're different from each other. And then we've got, with differentiation, it's how the actualized reality is different from other potential possible actualized realities that could have emerged. So both refer to difference, but on kind of in different spheres, in different places. The former in the idea, the second in the actualized reality. So that's a tidy distinction to keep in mind. Important, Deleuze stresses this, individuation precedes differentiation. So individuation comes first. It's the how of actualization. It's what intensity does. It's how intensity is able to determine eventual actualization. And the other thing that I wanted to mention here is the reference to quality, number, species, and part, and the way that these make up the generality of an individual. So there are three comments I wanted to make. The first is that these four features, quality, number, species, part, they are the extension and the quality that will be explicated. We've talked about these before. So the quality and the species refer to what we've called in the past quality, or quale. qualia, and the number and the part, these refer to extension, or what we called qualitas. So that's just kind of some terminology, just laying out the terms so that we're all clear on what these mean. Secondly, Deleuze says they are the general features of an individual. So they make up, that they determine the general line, but not the specifics of what the actualized reality is going to be. So they give us a general structure, if you like, for the particular that is going to be actualized. And third, they're not primary. They are, Deleuze says, imprisoned within individuals as though in a crystal. So they are determined by the field of individuation. And that's the key point. We're back to this idea, individuation precedes differenciation. So the individuation is that it's the, again, the driving force. It's what makes this, it's what makes these explicated features possible. It's what allows these features to be explicated. That's better. And there's a good example that Deleuze gives here, which I think does clarify. He says the egg, if we think about an egg, the egg is the field of individuation within which the embryo is a pure individual, which is determining the actualization of the organism. And Deleuze says, so what we have again is this idea of individuation before actualization. In other words, individualization precedes both organization, extension, and the determination of species or quality. So it's worth keeping that analogy in mind, I think, as you try and come to grips with this idea of individuation, that the egg is a field of individuation, and that's what Deleuze is talking about when he's talking about this this idea. And the embryo within it, that's the individual. So it's not a full organism yet, but the embryo is it's the individual, which is setting up those general features. It's determining the features, the general features that the organism will eventually have. And so the egg then is like this metastable field, and that's a really important way to think about this. The field of the metaphor of a field is really useful. You've got this kind of zone, this sphere, this region of individuation, and the individual arises within that. So I think it's a good analogy to keep in mind, this idea that first the word field is useful here. Thinking about, when we think about what individuation is, it's helpful to have this idea of a field within which the individual emerges. So it's not like the individual is not kind of arising out of nothing, or kind of arising as the end of a process in a kind of linear, thinking of it in a linear fashion. If you think of that, then then it's just like it's not the right picture. It's not the way that Deleuze and Simondon, for that matter, are thinking of this. There's the individuation is a field which encompasses the individual, which emerges from within it. And that's a really important metaphor to keep in mind, I think, to really understand this properly. Okay, so anyway, we're at the last part of the video already. And basically I've just got 3 quotes, and I'm going to fire them off at you, and then because I think they each give us some important insights into individuation for Deleuze. So the first quote: "We think that difference of intensity, as this is implicated in the egg, expresses first the differential relations or virtual matter to be organized. This intensive field of individuation determines the relations that it expresses to be incarnated in spatiotemporal dynamisms, dramatization, in species which correspond to the distinctive points in these relations, organic differenciation." So there's just so much in that, right? The big thing that I wanted to pull out from that is that we can think of this in terms of three regions. So you've got the ideas, which are the differential relations. That's the first region. Second region is implication / individuation. And that's where we're talking about intensities, and that where the field of individuation is set up and the individual emerges. And then the third region, which is explication differenciation with a C. So if we just go back to the first of those regions, with the idea and the differential relations within that, that difference, the difference that arises within that virtual multiplicity, that is intensive. It's fundamentally intensive, and that is what leads to the setting up of this intensive field when those differential relations are implicated in that second step, and in the process of individuation. So it's that which intensity kind of, it's like, I don't know, I think of it like this, the drive from the idea to the individuation as those differential relations are implicated. And so we get to then we have this field of individuation, which is fundamentally intensive because it's intensity that has brought it about. And then once those, and then from that, the field of individuation, then we move to the actual explication, which is where where extension and quality are explicated, and that this happens. They're expressed in spatiotemporal dynamisms. So, and they're kind of expressed in, they're dramatized, or that they are dramatized, if you like. I don't know if I've explained that very well, but you've got the ideas, and then this is the field that we're talking about, the second one, the region of implication individuation, which is fundamentally intensive, and then the third region, explication differentiation, which is fundamentally dramatized, and that's the reference to spatiotemporal dynamisms. Okay, so let me leave that there. The second quote goes like this: "Individuation always governs actualization. The organic parts are induced only on the basis of the gradients of their intensive environment, the types determined in their species only by virtue of the individuating intensity. Throughout, intensity is primary in relation to organic extensions and to species qualities." So what I thought was important about that quote is the way that we get more detail here on how specifically how extension and quality are explicated or actualized. And so this extension quality, this is a reference back to a couple of quotes ago. We talked about quality, number, species, parts. That's what we're talking about here. And so Deleuze says the organic parts, which are extension, they're actualized according to the intensive environment. So that's the field of individuation itself, the milieu in which the individual arises. So that's the gradients that exist within that milieu, within that, going back to the egg, within the egg itself, the differences there. That's what determines the actualization of organic parts. And the other one, the Deleuze, the other half of this are the types, and these are the species qualities, and these are determined by individuating intensity, Deleuze says. And I take this to mean the specific intensive quantities between elements. So instead of the field as a whole and the gradients that exist between those elements is explicated as extension, and the actual intensive quantities between those elements, not just the gradient, not just the difference itself, but the actual quantities, what I will call in the next video the distance. I'll make the distinction between depth and distance. And so the actual distance as the specific intensive quantity, that's what determines the type or the species or the quality. And those two separate, they're not separate, but those two distinct kinds of explication, they go right back to what we talked about. I think this was chapter 4 when we looked at actualization and incarnation, where actualization is the explication of, what is it? Actualization is the explication of the qualities, and the incarnation is the explication of the extension. That probably means nothing to anybody except me, but this is why it took me so long to prepare this for this video, because I'm just trying to get all of these pieces and make sure they're all lined up properly. And I think they do line up, but it's just a bit of an effort to make sure that to get them all into the spot where they need to be. So the last quote, the nucleus and the genes designate only the differentiated matter. In other words, the differential relations which constitute the pre-individual field to be actualized. But their actualization is determined only by the cytoplasm, with its gradients and its fields of individuation. So we're still talking about the egg, right? Still, that's kind of that's the example we're using. But this was quite illustrative, I thought. So the actualization of the pre-individual differential relations within the idea, and this is the nucleus and the genes as elements in the organism as a biological idea. So remember, we talked about the organism as a biological idea, I think in, I don't know what chapter it was, maybe chapter 3, but this was quite a while ago when we're talking about ideas. So the nucleus and genes are the elements within the biological idea. These are the pre-individual differential relations. And the actualization of these is determined by the field of individuation and the individuating intensity. And this is the cytoplasm. And that's what, that's that surrounding, that's that field within which the individual will form, which will eventually actualize as the concrete reality. So I think that's a good, another another idea to grasp there to understand this. The nucleus and genes, they are the pre-individual differential relations in the idea, and then the field of individuation and the individuating intensity, that's the cytoplasm, which forms a milieu out of which the individual can emerge. All right, we better hit a summary. So this whole video was about individuation. The first thing we did was note some comparisons with Simondon, Gilbert Simondon, and that was interesting. There were a lot of similarities there, and this really did strike me when I read Difference and Repetition for the first time. That Simondon, by the way, is definitely worth reading, if I didn't say that already. But lots of similarities. We talked about the idea of the metastable field correlating with Deleuze's virtual ideal. They both emphasize difference, they both talk about singularities, and they both frame the whole thing in terms of problems and solutions. And so individuation itself is basically how intensity determines the actualization of differential relations. It's the bridge between differential relations and the ultimate actualization. And it does this in those two different ways. The first was extension, the actualization of extension, which are the parts. And this is individuated according to the gradients in the intensive environment. So this was the milieu. This was just the differences that exist between different elements within that intensive field. And the other form of actualization was quality, and this was the species, and this is determined according to the individuating intensities. And this I equated with the specific intensive quantities between the different elements within that intensive environment, that field of individuation. So you've got those two different ways in which intensity determines the eventual actualization of those differential relations. The example we looked at was the egg as a field of individuation and the embryo as the individual which emerges from it, which will determine the actualization of the final concrete reality. And another point that I just wanted to throw in here is those three regions that I mentioned, because I think that's helpful for getting a picture on what Deleuze is talking about here. The three regions, the first was the idea itself, and the differential relations that make it up, the virtual multiplicity, we called that. Then the second region is implication individuation, and this is where this is the intensities. This is what we called the implicated multiplicities, and it's here that the individual arises or emerges within the field of individuation, and this is fundamentally intensive. So this whole region, as I'm calling it, this whole movement, if you like, is characterized or defined by intensity. And then the final region is that of explication, differenciation. And this is the final step of actualization itself, where those the extensities and the qualities are explicated in or as dramatized, so with those spatiotemporal dynamisms as well. And so that's individuation. Hopefully that has clarified some of the finer points that are related to individuation here. Anyway, hopefully that helped. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.